He has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful, may the peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon you. Welcome to this, the 17th episode of Presspoint. Today we'll be looking at the 30 years since Ordinance 20. Ordinance 20 is of course the infamous legislation which was introduced by General Zia-ul-Haq, essentially the military dictator, in Pakistan 30 years ago to this date, within April 2014 is the 30 years since this point. Now, Ordinance 20 is, of course, not only declaring Ahmadis to be non-Muslim and carrying on that tradition of persecution, but it's even more fundamental than that. It infringes the fundamental beliefs of Ahmadi Muslims to profess their faith within Pakistan. But also it sparked a whole outrage and a tidal wave almost of martyrdoms and murders, which we'll be focusing on in today's show. We'll be looking not only at the impact within Pakistan, but also across the world and how this infamous ordinance has sparked persecution not only of Ahmadi Muslims, but also of religious minorities the world over. I'm joined as ever by my beloved brother Farooq Mahmood in the studio.
Jazakallah, thank you very much, Jonathan. Of course, today we're discussing about this infamous 1984 Ordinance 20 by General Zia-ul-Haq. He promulgated something which is definitely unseen, unheard of in 21st century. How many Ahmadis have been persecuted, killed, they've been hated by people around them? This is one piece of that abhorrent piece of law which has made every Ahmadi's life very difficult. They can't profess, practice or propagate the religion the way anybody else could do. Also, on a daily basis, things can't be done normally anyway. If you're affected by this, directly or indirectly, please do share with us. You can send us your emails to presspoint@mt.tv, or you can send us your tweets, but please use the hashtag PresspointMTA. Jonathan.
We're joined in the studio by two of our very blessed to be joined in the studio by initially Dr. Iftikhar Iyaz, Ahmad Iyaz, on my immediate left. Dr. Iftikhar Iyaz is, of course, not only an international diplomat with the Tuvalu Islands in the Pacific, but also is the chair of the Human Rights Committee within the Ahmadiyya community. Welcome to the show, Dr. Iyaz.
Thank you. Jazakallah.
Also, we're joined by Khalil Yusuf, who's the Director of Communications for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community Press and Media Office. Welcome to the show, Mr. Yusuf, as well. Also, Farooq, today we'll have some special guests via Skype. We'll be introducing them shortly as we come to them in due time. Now, starting with part one of the show today, we're looking, as we mentioned, at Ordinance 20. Now, as we explained, Ordinance 20 is a piece of legislation which came in and has had a really tremendous impact on the ordinary, everyday lives of Ahmadi Muslims within Pakistan and around the world. But in particular, in recent events, Brother Farooq, we've seen that there have been a number of martyrdoms which have taken place. And I think you've been doing a lot of research on this, which can hopefully give our viewers an insight into some of the tragedy and the suffering that Ordinance 20 is causing within Pakistan. What did you find, brother?
It's been a regular feature now. The martyrdoms of Ahmadis are happening as a regular thing, and we're noticing that the numbers are increasing, the frequency is going up as well over the years. In the last 30 years, ever since that infamous Ordinance 20 was enacted. Even before that, in 1974, when the Ahmadis were declared non-Muslims, effectively there was no change to Ahmadis' lives. But 84, in fact, was a brent on everyone's life, really, practically, in living daily life. Looking at some of the recent very sad stories. First one, if you can see my screen, is Imtiaz Ahmad Sahib, who's been murdered in Pakistan in cold blood. He was father of 3. He was shot dead in front of the shop in Nawabshah. And just 6 years after, his uncle was also martyred in the same very city of Nawabshah. And it's the 9th such incident, such martyrdom in that one particular city in the last few years. At the same time, we've got another story, the same story on Daily Times, English newspaper in Pakistan, says Ahmadi shot dead in Nawabshah. Now, one thing good about the English language newspapers in Pakistan is that they are fairer than the vernacular press in Pakistan, which is the Urdu press, which normally is very, very unfair and sometimes almost persecuting Ahmadi's feelings regularly. The next one is the Washington Post, on Washington Times, a letter to the editor by someone with the name Iqbal Khan Sahib, and he's sent something which makes perfect sense. He says that the martyrdom of Imtiaz Ahmed, and then going a couple of months back on the 26th of May, Dr. Mehdi Ali from America, who went to Pakistan, he got martyred. He went to save people's lives, but his life was taken away because he was an Ahmadi Muslim. And he says the reason is hidden within 74 anti-Ahmadi constitution, in the amendment to Constitution 74, and then 84, the enactment of the Ordinance 20. And they are the direct reasons for what's happened or what's happening in Pakistan right now. Then looking at story on CBC, slain Dr. Mehdi Ali Qamar was servant of humanity. A very common sort of expression we're noticing is to use the word humanity in his service to mankind. And this man was a very able cardiologist from America, who comes to Pakistan just to serve people without getting paid for it, takes with him about 80 heart stents to save people's lives, but eventually what happens is somebody just kills him for no obvious reason but the one which is embedded in Pakistan's constitution, and Pakistan's every Pakistani individual will understand that how Ahmadis are living life differently to other people in that country. Then looking at your press and media office has collated a lot of different news items from around the world, and this particular martyrdom of Dr. Mehdi Ali Qamar, who was a dual national of Canada and America, about 200 print, online and television outlets worldwide have covered his cold-blooded murder. Dawn newspaper in Pakistan, Columbus Dispatch, Wall Street Journal, Time, the Washington Post, Huffington Post, Reuters, CNN, Fox News, BBC, New York Times, Daily Mail, and the list goes on and on. And then one particular article which really drew my attention on Dawn.com by a non-Ahmadi individual from Pakistan. I scrolled down to something which really has touched many people's hearts, because even Hazur mentioned in his Friday sermon this particular excerpt. This gentleman says that, "I'm sorry, Dr. Qamar Ali Mehdi, I failed to protect you, but I raise my voice against this persecution. I forgo my safety just so that tomorrow I don't die unheard." And lastly, just a sentence which sums up everything very nicely of what the head of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, said on 30th of May last month. He said, after the death of Dr. Mehdi Ali Qamar, he says, Ahmadis around the world should pray for Pakistani Ahmadis because they are now living in extremely intolerable conditions and the situation is worsening. That sums everything up.
So some obviously tragic cases. If I can turn to yourself, Mr. Yusuf, I mean, we're dealing with two men who've been martyred recently. Let's say, take these two recent examples. Let's look at Mr. Mehdi Ali, for example, who's come over from the US. He's a doctor in the US. He's a very well-known cardiologist. He's come purely to save lives for the service of humanity. Why would somebody want to kill him? Why has somebody gone out of their way to find him, track him down, and to kill him? What's going on here? What's the reasoning behind it?
Well, there's no good reason, and such criminal behaviour isn't justified by anything. But the reality is, in Pakistan, there is an institutional violence, an institutional prejudice against Ahmadi Muslims and against Shias, against Sufis, against other minorities as well. We don't consider ourselves to be a minority because we're Muslims. But what Dr. Mehdi Ali Qamar had done was he had sacrificed his time and effort to come to Pakistan to serve the people of Pakistan, to serve the nation of Pakistan. The Thayer Heart Institute, which he was involved in establishing, carries out just under 150,000 operations a year. And that's not just of Ahmadi Muslims, there's others as well. And what you're finding is that extremists are taking such an extreme view that they're posting pamphlets that say, if you have treatment in order to fix a condition that might kill you at the Thayer Heart Institute, well, that is a sin against Islam. So it is this type of ridiculousness, if you like, that characterizes the madness that is going on in Pakistan. An individual who has come to Pakistan to save lives, to help to heal people, has actually become the victim of violence, not because of anything he's done or not because of anything he's said, but simply because of what he believes. And that is a real problem, more for Pakistan as a whole than it is for Ahmadis.
Okay. So Mr. Yusuf's called it ridiculous, Mr. Iftikhar Yaz. I mean, this is coming from a particular place, isn't it, Mr. Yaz? This is coming from, I believe, what is the connection, if you could explain to us, between these killings and Ordinance 20? Is there some connection which you can place for the viewers at home so they can understand it in its context?
Well, I think it will help better understanding if we see where it started. As we know, Zia came into power, and immediately when he came into power, he was very strongly against the political stance of Bhutto. And he said Pakistan was established as an Islamic state, and Pakistan must be made into an Islamic state. And immediately he started the Islamization program in Pakistan, which was establishing, as he called, Nizam-e-Mustafa. And that was the beginning of fomenting violence and acts of terrorism amongst the people of Pakistan. And as you know, prior to his coming to this position, he was the coordinator of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, fighting against the Russians. And then during that period, millions of Afghanis, they came over across the border into Pakistan with their weapons, with their cocaine, and all those narcotics, you see, which they were used to in their own living in Afghanistan. And then he established, with the help from Saudi Arabia, nearly 300 madrasas to train these people into actually, according to him, Mujahideen warriors, but they were actually turning into, later on, Taliban and active terrorists. So he was the person who actually sowed the seeds of terrorism in Pakistan, which have become a nightmare for the whole world today. So that was the beginning. And then he was very strong in trying to establish his Islamization in Pakistan. And gradually, he thought that the most strong and powerful religious organization against this Islamization is the Ahmadiyya movement. And that is why he said Ahmadiyya movement, Ahmadis are a cancer, and we have to completely eradicate and remove them from Pakistan. This is what he had said. And when he was warned by the US Foreign Affairs Department and by the United Nations that this is a very wrong direction he is taking to legislate such infamous ordinances like the Ordinance 20, he said, I don't care what the United Nations says or what the human rights organizations say. He totally rejected. So
really the origin is coming from some sort of a corruption of Islam, and this is what I wanted
exactly,
particularly with regards to this issue of Islamization you've mentioned, Mr. Yaz.
Yes.
If I could put it to you as well, Mr. Yusuf, we're talking about Islam, it seems. The word Islam is coming up often with regards to General Zia al-Haq and also Ordinance 20. To what extent is it actually Islamic to say that Ahmadi Muslims or Shia Muslims or Sufi Muslims are not Muslim, and therefore we can persecute them and kill them? Is that Islamic, Mr. Yusuf?
No. I mean, it absolutely isn't. The question is, how do you identify who is a Muslim and who isn't? It isn't the role of any individual who believes in Islam to make that up for themselves. You have to look at the sources of law, if you like, to identify who is a Muslim and who isn't. And the primary sources of law for Muslims are the Holy Quran and the Sunnat of the Holy Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and then the Hadith in that order. So in order to identify who is a Muslim, you have to look at what is written in the Holy Quran and you have to look at what was the established, consistent practice of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you will find that throughout his lifetime, and even afterwards, at the time of Hazrat Abu Bakr, anhu, when there were individuals who were campaigning against Islam, nobody was declared non-Muslim. And they were not declared non-Muslim because it is not the place of an individual to make decisions about what is the belief of one person and what is not the belief of an individual. So the question is, well, what is the status of an edict or a fatwa that is imposed by some religious cleric that says Ahmadi Muslims are non-Muslims, or Shias are non-Muslims, or Sufis are non-Muslims? Because essentially the view of all of the 73 sects is different, and if you take the view of each one of them, then everybody by implication would then be non-Muslim. So what is the status then of somebody who passes that fatwa? It is nothing more than a personal belief about what is acceptable in Islam and what is not acceptable in Islam. Nothing more than that. It is not for an individual to go about deciding on the personal beliefs of an individual and saying, well, the whole of the Muslim world must now deny the belief of a particular group of Muslims.
Okay, so it's clearly some form of a corruption of what we've heard is the Quran, the Hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. It's clearly corruption. There seems to be something very deeply woven into not only Pakistani society, but also the wider, perhaps we might say, scholastic opinions of some of the leaders of the Muslim world. So I think we can come back to this issue as well. If I can now go to the Skype guests, in particular, if I can first go to Dr. Fahim Yunus, who is one of the spokespersons of the Ahmadiyya community within America, and obviously a very active media commentator within Huffington Post and other sources. If I can come to yourself, Dr. Yunus. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Now Dr. Mehdi Hasan was obviously an American. He was from Colombia. He learned his trade as a doctor within America. He saved many lives in America, and he was one of your leading cardiologists. What sort of an impact has it had on the American people and the American media, the murder of this innocent man?
Wolf Blitzer said it very truly on CNN when he did a segment about it, and he said, Dr. Mehdi Ali is a doctor from US. He goes back to Pakistan. He volunteers his own time, his own money. He's there to help mankind, and he's gunned down only for doing that act of goodness. So that was very succinctly captured on CNN, and that has essentially been the narrative here in America. Wherever we talk to people, people are simply in shock. They cannot understand what kind of a society in this day and age will first go and find their best and most accomplished people and then simply kill them. So this is the reality. I think it has given awareness to what Islam and Ahmadiyyat is all about, and moreover, our reaction to that, the peaceful reaction from the community.
In particular, we saw some really, to some extent, you might say heartbreaking images of the receipt of the body of Mr. Mehdi Ali Hasan, Mehdi Ali Saab, when he returned to America. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of his funeral and the reception which he received when he came back to American and Canadian soil?
And I'll tell you that I wrote a piece about it for Fox News, and typically it takes 3, 4, 5 days for that editorial process to be completed. But the editor called me that day and she said, it's such a heart-wrenching piece. It's such a sad, tragic story that I would like to run it on the day of the funeral. And I told her, I said, I'm on my way to Canada to attend the funeral, and that's going to be in the next 14 hours. And she said, I'll make sure that this piece is up and running before that. That was the impact. And then when I went to Canada, of course, there were thousands of people there. There were about 6,000 to 7,000 people easily. There were diplomats, there was press corps, and people were simply in shock at what Pakistan did to their best, and moreover, at how thousands of these young people, how they reacted with prayer and patience.
It's interesting, you say what Pakistan did to their best. This man was in his origin Pakistani, was he not? He was from Pakistan, and he was going back to his home country to save the lives of his fellow citizens, and he was murdered. So I think it's. I know you didn't intend to confuse that, but I think it's important as well for us to remember that this is in fact not only an American that's been killed, but this is a Pakistani killed in Pakistan, and I think that even adds to some of the tragedy, the perversion. If I could ask you quickly, just before we come back to the studio, Dr. Yunus, with regards to the particular the murder, the martyrdom of Dr. Yunus that we've just seen. Sorry, Dr. Mehdi. How did the Ahmadi Muslims in America respond? Because I can imagine if one of my best friends or my family was murdered, or if anybody's best friends or family was murdered, it would cause such pain. Did they react with a call for blood and a call for revenge, a call for violence?
Responded the way Holy Quran asks us to respond, with prayers and patience, and from Allah we come and to Allah we return. But what people also now understand, that kind of a response is not innate. That kind of a response is something that is nurtured over centuries, and that is the true Khilafat and the message of Islam and Ahmadiyya that has instilled that response in our DNA. And people all around us have seen us. The American Doctors Association, there's a Pakistani North American Doctors Association here who have done protests on our behalf. They know that our community does not go out for street protests. They have done protests in front of the Pakistani embassy in New York on our behalf. That is how deeply people have been moved by this story, that they stood up for us, even the Pakistanis.
Dr. Yunus, thank you very much for joining us. We'll come back to our Skype guests shortly. But before we do that, we'll do some tweets. But I think it's worth mentioning as well, just for the viewers at home, and also for the family of the deceased who's been mentioned today. Our prayers are with them. But also, any life which is lost is equal. And the only reason we're focusing particularly on the martyrdom of Dr. Mehdi is because of some of the international issues it throws up. But in the Holy Quran, it says that to take the life of one is to take the life of all of humanity. So our prayers and our thoughts are with the families and the friends of both of the deceased. Brother Farouk, could you tell us a bit about these tweets?
Yes, the issue is of course ongoing. One martyrdom mentioned is Dr. Mehdi Ali's, but of course it's carrying on. It's going on with other people as well, and Imtiaz Ahmed Sahib, and God knows how many more, unless something happens practically to stop this. We know that 84 Ordinance was a bit like one of the last nails in the coffin of justice in Pakistan. And what's happening is the response on the online media, through Twitter in particular, has been very overwhelming. Yasir Latif Hamdani, one of the well-known names in Pakistan, who is a lawyer and also an activist in human rights, he says, you can see my screen, stop killing people for believing differently. Very succinct and a very strong message. Aisha Noor says, today Nawab Shah is yet again stained with innocent Ahmadi blood. So when she says yet again, probably she means that because of the 9th incident of this nature in Nawab Shah in the last few years, clearly it is something which must be stopped. Then Austin says something which is again heart-wrenching and a very emotional sentence he has put in. He says that, rest in peace, Dr. Qamar. Dr. Qamar said, I am going to save 80 lives. He lost his own. Referring to, I think, those 80 heart stents he was carrying with him for the 3rd time when he went to Pakistan to save the mankind. But of course it says that he's lost his life, but as we believe that he hasn't lost his life, he's living forever. He is a martyr. And the last thing for the time being is a message from Mirza Jawad, who says, so of them is he who accomplished his vow, and of them is he who yet waits. So perhaps he's referring to one of the Quranic verses from Surah Al-Ahzab about those people who have fulfilled their pledges. So clearly, Dr. Mehdi Ali, and Mr. Imtiaz Ahmed, and many more like them have fulfilled their pledges.
Thank you very much for those tweets, Farouk. If I can come to yourself, Dr. Iyaz, I think when you were listening to Yunus, you had some thoughts you wanted to contribute.
Well, actually, I wanted to present a quote from Hazrat Amir Mu'mineen, Ayatollah ibn Nasir al-Aziz, on which he ended his sermon relating to Dr. Mehdi. And he put it very clearly. He said, the oppression in Pakistan is taking place in the name of God and His messenger, in the name of that messenger who was a benefactor of humanity and was a mercy for all the worlds. So our hearts bleed at this tragedy, but at the same time, we are not defeated. We are going to defeat this oppression that is there, and it will be defeated by the decree of Allah. And the second point, which is an attribute to Dr. Mehdi Ali, is that his life was dedicated and devoted to the service of humanity and to the service of God. And through his martyrdom, he attracted such worldwide media attention, and every media source presented the message of peace that Ahmadiyyat and the head of the Ahmadiyya movement is conveying to the entire humanity and the world. And through the media resources from all over the world, USA, Canada, Pakistan, India, and everywhere in the world, the message, the true message of the promised Messiah, for which he dedicated and sacrificed his life, was conveyed to millions and millions of people to the corners of the world. So this is a great tribute to his life. His life was ended, but it was not ended fruitlessly. It is going to bear fruit and flowers forever.
It's very true. And I think actually there's, this raises some of the wider issues about why this is happening, I think. And Mr. Yusuf, you've told us briefly about Ordinance 20. If you can give us I think we've used or focused on those particular martyrdoms, those tragedies, to help us to understand the personal pain of people in Pakistan, to understand their experience. But this is a wider structural problem, isn't it? And it's part of a whole, which is really the demonization, the persecution of an entire people within the biggest Muslim nation in the world. Can you just tell us a little bit about what sort of an impact this Ordinance 20, which is now 30 years old and since 1984, what sort of impact it had on wider society within Pakistan?
Do you mind if I give you a little bit of background before I answer
Please
that question? As especially Farouk will know very well, Ahmadis were declared non-Muslim by the Second Constitutional Amendment in 1974. There's not time to cover some of the background information, but anybody who hasn't seen From Democracy to Extremism, which is a fantastic NTA documentary covering this point, I absolutely recommend them to do that. That was led by Farouk. Ahmadis were declared non-Muslim by constitutional amendment in 1974, on the 7th of September 1974. Since then, Ahmadis' day-to-day practice, other than in relation to voting when a separate electoral list was introduced in 1978, was unaffected. And that was something that really upset the extremists, because for a very long time the extremists had been targeting Ahmadi Muslims. They wanted to eradicate them. There were major anti-Ahmadi riots in 1952, and extremists, although a little bit quiet during the 60s, by the time they got to the 1970s had really got hold of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, whose political standing was weakening, and they used the Ahmadi Muslim issue to try and push their political agenda. Although Zulfikar Ali Bhutto attracted them in order to try and maintain his power, the snake of extremism that he was feeding ultimately bit him. And then Zia-ul-Huq took power, I think it was in June 1977. The first thing he did was he hanged Bhutto. The second thing he did was he got into bed with Jamaat Islami and some of the other extremist groups and began, as Iftikhar Sahib said, an Islamization agenda. Ahmadi Muslims were at the center of that. And so by 1980, he had begun to make changes to legislation. The court, in a case, Nusrat Bhutto Begum, had affirmed that he was able to maintain power. He, through various ordinances, undermined the power and strength of the Supreme Court and began then to introduce legislation in 1980 which was designed to persecute minorities. In 1984, he introduced another piece of legislation, which was Ordinance 20 of 1984, that was targeted specifically at Ahmadi Muslims. That criminalized the very existence of Ahmadis. So whilst in 1974 our name was changed, now in 1984 our very practice was also not only under scrutiny, but was prohibited by law. That was something, incidentally, in 1978 in a case called Mubashir versus Shah, the Lahore High Court said was not legal. The Lahore High Court had said that you cannot prevent Ahmadi Muslims from calling their mosques mosques or from performing azan. But you see, Ziaul Haq, who had taken over control of Pakistan in a dictatorship, he had no electoral mandate, had decided that he was going to make what he thought an example of Ahmadi Muslims, and in instituting this legislation felt that he was going to get rid of, absolutely eradicate and destroy Ahmadi Muslims in a way that they had not been able to do over the course of the last 25 or 30 years. So I'm going to leave it at that, because there's some, the mother pits are, yeah.
But no, that's
afterwards.
a really useful insight, because I think for me myself, I certainly feel that that's contextualized it. Hopefully for the viewers at home, that gives them an insight, yeah? But I think for Brother Farooqi, you've now brought us up to date as well, or I think you're about to, with some research which has looked at how Ordinance 20 is now being used as the justification for essentially some of the most inhumane treatment that we can see on the face of the earth in present times, if that's not too strong a phrase.
Brother Jonathan, the issue that began with Ahmadiyya as an Ahmadiyya issue in inverted commas in 74, as you mentioned very clearly, of course, we declared non-Muslims. Then 84 came out. 74 was effectively just called as non-Muslims, but 84 was practically our existence was a crime in true sense, because the way we would act, we can't act the way. I mean, we walk as Muslims, can't walk as Muslims. Even ladies wearing burqa, for example, covering themselves, is also like Muslims. So that's also wrong. Having minarets is wrong. Having dome is wrong. Offering salat is wrong. Calling azan is wrong. So everything's wrong. So basically our existence is wrong in Pakistan ever since. But the thing is now, the things have changed now for worse for Pakistan overall. And it's spilling over in Pakistan and outside Pakistan's boundaries, which began with Pakistani, the Ahmadiyya issue. I'm looking at one of the stories on Washington Post here, which says the sectarian killings soar in Pakistan, raising fears of regional spillover. Very well, it sums up what the problem is. The next one is, in fact, a blog on the religion section of the Huffington Post by Jawad Kaleem. He says, religious minorities in Islamic Pakistan struggle, but survive amid increasing persecution. They have no choice but to survive. They are surviving, but that's mere survival in Pakistan at the moment. And it's not just Ahmadis, it's even Shias, it's Sufis, it's Barelvis, people of various different denominations within Islam, and again, non-Muslims, of course, Hindus and Christians, they all fall under the umbrella of those people who deserve to be persecuted, and it's all legalized. And then The Diplomat, one of the Asia-Pacific papers, that says Pakistan's Shia under attack, the government is failing to act to prevent the slaughter of Balochistan Shias. Now, looking at these very strong words, I mean, one should not be surprised, because that clearly is what's happening anyway at the moment. And that brings us to one of the books we've come recently across, which is it's called The Ulama in Contemporary Islam by Muhammad Qasim Zaman, and he addresses the issue. This book is slightly old, from 2002, then the next edition came in 2007, but the issue is very current. Now, this gentleman talks about the ulama and their role in Southeast Asia, in Iran, in Middle East, and other places in the world, and how it's changed. Ulama are the religious scholars, thank you.
Yeah,
and how that's changed. And primarily is looking at the Shia scholars as well as the Sunni scholars, and how their role has changed and how they're deemed to be in the eyes of the other Muslims. Now go to page 114 of this book, and I think it gives us the background very well. It says, though certain prominent leaders of the Pakistan Shia are known to have supported the persecution of the Ahmadis, the history of violence against the Ahmadis supplied the anti-Shia front with some of its most vigorous leadership. And then he mentions one of the leading extremist organizations in Pakistan. So what he's saying is, in fact, this all began with Ahmadis, and that was prophesied by the third Khalifa of Ahmadi Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmad, in 1974, that if you once open the Pandora's box, then everybody will be the next target. And that's exactly what's happening. So probably it's the right time for us to go and have a look at one of the excerpts from the interviews we took from a couple of gentlemen from Pakistan. One is Mr. Ayar Rahman. He works for the Human Rights Commission in Pakistan. He's a director there, by the way. And then Wajahat Masood. He's a journalist and an academic. So let's hear what they say about the impact of the 84 Ordinance on daily lives of Ahmadis.
Ordinance 20 is a very discriminatory piece of legislation, totally mischievous, and it doesn't help the minorities at all, it oppresses them. This is specific to Ahmadis, you know. Otherwise, there is no bar for an Englishman or a German or a Christian or a Buddhist from saying Assalamu alaikum. Nothing happens. So this is a specific restriction on Ahmadis, and I think no civilized society should have them. You know, Ziaul Haq made vulnerable communities more vulnerable because he encouraged oppression of minorities. He encouraged he introduced the blasphemy law. He encouraged the people to file blasphemy cases. People were rewarded. So he used every trick to divide the Muslim society in order to continue or maintain his position.
A book of law is not supposed to encompass or contain the word Muslim or Sikh. It has to be a law is meant for the population in a certain area under the writ of a certain state. Why did not Muslims bother to define the word Muslim for more than 350 years, up to 1953? Muslim community had been having a history of 13.5 centuries by then. Why define Muslims? And who should define Muslim? Me being a human being, I believe faith does not need definition. The basic criterion of faith is something which somebody accepts, some individual accepts. I again say, a religion is an individual right. It is not a collective right. It's not something to be imposed. We do have a right to a faith, but it is our prerogative. It is a right, it's not a coercion. Why did we need defining Muslim? 2, I don't want to get into the doctrinal debates and references. I believe dozens and dozens of sects, Muslim sects, over the centuries have considered the rest of the Muslims as non-Muslims, which is part of their doctrine, which is okay as long as they do not carry a gun or a sword or a dagger to put that faith into some nefarious act. So the very search for a definition of Muslim was to me ominous, and I absolutely believe that it is not possible. It is not possible, and if somebody believes that it is possible, then they should now take Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Spy Muhammad on one table and ask them to define Muslims. Then they should go ahead with it. Then they should take it to its logical end.
So very, very good to hear from some prominent voices within Pakistan looking to examine and critically assess what is in reality a grave human rights abuse stemming from for more than 30 years from Ordinance 84. And before that, it was simply happening as on a de facto factual element that even without the law there was still persecution. But now let's go to our Skype guest, Dr. Qasim Rashid. Mr. Qasim Rashid, I may have given you an honorific title which you're yet to merit, but I'm sure you can in future years. If I can go to the USA to speak to Mr. Rashid, and particularly I'd like to ask Mr. Rashid, you yourself in the USA, as well as a number of other spokespeople, have been able to engage very prominently with the media on persecution issues relating to Ordinance 20. What sort of an impact, Mr. Rashid, do you think this sort of awareness has had, and in particular, has it had an impact in stemming the tide of persecution?
Well, the latter remains to be seen as far as stemming the tide of persecution, because we see every week another Ahmadi Muslim murdered for his faith. So I think that's going to be a longer process. But as far as developing a relationship with the media here, with our elected officials, with government leaders, with civic activists, I think by the grace of Allah, we've been able to establish that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community are in fact those Muslims who are dedicated towards the improvement of all humanity. And that's happened through a combination of media efforts, through personal relationships and bridge building. But I think the most powerful argument that we've been able to put forth is that despite these persecutions and these murders and this ongoing boycott of Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan, our response has been one of patience, one of prayer, and one of continued service to humanity per the guidance of Khalifatul al-Masih. And I think when you define Islam as those things and you act that out and then you attribute that this is only possible because of His Holiness, the Khalifa of Islam, it's a very difficult example to argue against. And so as a result, it's been creating more and more awareness here in the West, certainly here in the United States and Canada. But I think we have a long way to go to make that awareness here translate into an effective repeal of things like Ordinance 20 in Pakistan.
Okay, which is a very fair assessment, but I think it's valuable that at least there's beginning to be the public recognition of what is essentially abuse, and then hopefully the practical abolition of this abuse can come later. And hopefully we've seen this, whether this be in the civil rights movement or the abolition of slavery, hopefully persecution can also be stemmed in a similar manner. But before we come back to the studio, if I can ask you another question, Mr. Rashid, and I'm putting you slightly on the spot here, but I know you're a lawyer, you work in the law, you've done a lot of focus on human rights and as part of your training. In your opinion, looking at Pakistan, it's the most populated Muslim country in the world. More than 200,000 Muslims live within Pakistan. It's an international player. It has international relationships with America. It receives a large amount of aid and development funding. So it's a central international player, is it not? But in addition, it has a constitution. It's signed up to many of the international human rights treaties. So my question to you is Ordinance 20 legal or is it illegal?
It's illegal not only in the international spectrum, but in Pakistan's own constitution. Look, Pakistan's own constitution is explicitly clear that religious freedom will remain free and that the government will not tolerate discrimination of any group. Pakistan has also signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, of which Articles 18 and 19, among others, are explicitly clear that there must be universal religious freedom. So Pakistan has not only signed this international treaty, but they've also ratified it, which means that they've internally agreed, their own legislature has voted and confirmed that yes, we will hold ourselves to this standard. And if I can make one small correction, it's actually over 200 million Muslims, not 200,000, but over 200 million Muslims in Pakistan. And part of the problem is that there just simply isn't enough education among the greater Muslim body in Pakistan to hold their own government accountable for violating international law in every facet of its existence.
Thank you very much for a very clear and straightforward legal answer to what is often avoided and in fact is often obfuscated, particularly within some of the international debate. It's very powerful to hear it stated quite so boldly that in fact Ordinance 20 in its 30th year is illegal. So I think a very valuable contribution. Thank you, Mr. Rashid. Now, Brother Farooq, I think that you want to take quite a hands-on approach. You've been looking and you found some imagery and some photography to give us a visual representation of some of the persecution in Pakistan.
Absolutely. Before looking at the images, let's look at the background to it. The Ordinance 20 is a very funny one, to be honest, because there are a lot of inconsistencies within that. And again, out of that, a lot of inconsistencies have sprouted out of this ordinance in particular. For example, it says that injuring or defiling places of worship with intent to insult the religion of any class, you get 2 years imprisoned. Then it says deliberate and malicious act intended to outrage religious feelings of any class by insulting its religion or religious beliefs, you get 10 years imprisonment. So clearly it also says that if Ahmadis are on the receiving end, then they should be able to go to court and they get the guy in the jail for 10 years. It's never happened. We'll show a few pictures there, and with those pictures we will understand that what's happening in Pakistan is clearly in light of that ordinance where those people should be taken to task, but they're not really. This is one of those billboards in Lahore which says that you can't befriend the Ahmadis because otherwise you'll be doing rebellion against the Holy Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And who has given this, this great message is the government of Punjab. And the name is Awqaf Department, which is one of the departments within the government of Punjab. And that is an official thing which goes as a billboard, not to befriend Ahmadis. Looking at this picture here, where they've defiled the Ahmadiyya mosque, destroyed it, 2 years imprisonment, hasn't happened. Look at this, a lot of Ahmadiyya graves have been desecrated. What's happening there? Nothing. A policeman here, custodian of law, is there in fact fiddling with somebody's grave, an Ahmadi Muslim's grave. What's the result? Nothing. And similarly, going forward, there's another message, a very clear message out there by Khatm-e-Nabuwat, the Finality of Prophethood organization in Pakistan, and they've said, they've given the phone number as well over there, very clearly, and they've said, and the English translation reads as follows, these Ahmadis, their punishment is death, in brackets murder. Killing these people is in an open market is jihad and virtue. And also says that you should awaken your conscience and being fearless mujahid or warrior of Khatm-e-Nabuwat and kill them and get position as a shaheed. And this person, the persons who are serving Islam, in inverted commas, as Khatm-e-Nabuwat organization, they've given their phone numbers as well. So have they ever been taken to task? The answer is definitely no. So, and also one more thing at the end, there's one of the prints you can see on the screen where district headquarter hospital, Courtly superintendent, he says he has rejected a tender, a commercial tender by an Ahmadi on the grounds that he is an Ahmadi. Whenever you give somebody a commercial tender, it's accepted or rejected on the grounds of price, or the price quoted. Here it clearly says in words that we're rejecting your tender because you're an Ahmadi Muslim, you're Ahmadi. So now, have we not really breached everything that's in that Ordinance 20 itself from the other end? Mm-hmm. So I think probably it's very obvious to the viewers that what's happening is all inconsistent.
It's a very powerful analysis to show not only the illegality of the ordinance, but also the blatant hypocrisy, contradiction, and inconsistency of the ordinance as well. So we're so vulnerable on every single ground that it can be looked at, I think, is what we're saying, yes? Mr. Yaz, if I could come to yourself. We've seen and we've heard the abuse, the murders being perpetrated under this ordinance, and we've heard quite clearly the immorality and the illegality of the ordinance as well. What's the route ahead? And in particular, in your opinion, what do you think about the response of the international community? Are they taking this seriously enough? And at the international level, you yourself are obviously involved in international affairs as a diplomat. What more can be done at the international level, perhaps?
The future of this nation of Pakistan and the country of Pakistan and the leadership of Pakistan is very clearly expressed by our fourth Khalifa, may Allah's mercy be upon him. Soon after this Ordinance 20 was promulgated, he warned Pakistan, and I quote, "The fear is that as a consequence of the prevailing circumstances in Pakistan, if God's prescribed decree takes effect, then great punishment days are ahead for the nation. The predestined days seem to be too miserable. Prescribed decree of God is that those who took to enmity and bad intentions, the same is made to fall on them." And there is a quote from Surah Al-Fajr, chapter 89, "Thy Lord then let fall on them the whip of punishment. Surely thy Lord is on the watch." The fulfillment of the scene, let fall on them, we have witnessed time and again. Every effort which was made against the Jamaat exactly turned against the opponents with negative result, and the efforts being made now are extremely mean and dirty. Those people who made the country and were first-class citizens have been forced into exile in their own country. If this condition does not change, then it is impossible that the nation is not punished which is punishing the innocent and the oppressed. A very strong warning from the fourth Khalifa. And we are a witness to see this exactly happening today. And when you talk about the international response, it is very unfortunate that the international response we find is also biased. For example, there was the case of two Christians in Pakistan, Rahmat and Rahat, probably, those were the two names. And they were decreed by the court on account of blaspheming the Holy Quran to be given the death sentence. This was passed. But the whole world media, there was a great uproar from every corner of the world, from the government, from the media. And under that uproar, the judiciary in Pakistan changed that verdict, and they withdrew the death sentence, and those two were released. So the uproar and the media attention and the world attention can definitely have some effect. Unfortunately, we don't see that happening in the case of Ahmadis. The world is a witness. They express sympathy. They express their sentiments, as they have done on the martyrdom of Dr. Mahdi and others as well. They've done that. But then the step they have to take is actually to stand firmly for the rights of humanity without any discrimination or thought, whatever their belief or faith is, and try to actually stand for justice in the world. Because unless they will stand for justice, the world will not be put right. They will not be able to follow the path which our beloved Imam has been trying to show to them, the path to peace and the paths to prosperity and success. That will not happen. So they have to stand on justice.
It's a very strong call for action. If I could quickly link this point, Dr. Yaz, with the point that Mr. Fahim Yunus raised earlier. If I could go to our Skype guest. Mr. Dr. Yunus, we've heard in the studio from Mr. Yaz that in fact the international community could be doing more and that there could be a stronger response. I want to also connect this because the international community, of course, isn't just Christian nations or agnostic nations or Buddhist nations, but as well, as Mr. Yaz has pointed out as well, it's Muslim nations as well. So Mr. Yunus, if I could ask yourself, perhaps taking into account your knowledge of Islam, and let's even say taking into account the practice of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, may peace be upon him, are the Muslim world doing enough? Are the powerful Muslim states who have such a close relationship with Pakistan, are they doing enough? What's your opinion on this?
No, they're not doing enough. And now when they are moving out from Pakistan, because not just Ahmadis, a lot of Pakistanis who are now moving out to the West, and they crib on every little tiny incidence of discrimination, even though when the law is on their side, even though when the law professes equality and liberty, even then they can't stand those little tiny issues of discrimination. Now those people are realizing themselves that what they're doing to Ahmadis in Pakistan, when an American of Pakistani descent faces small little discrimination here, they go back and reflect. And I think what Ayaz Saab was saying is absolutely true. Despite all our efforts, and I can tell you with authenticity, after writing 100 op-eds, after doing over 100 media interviews, I can tell you that what our Imam, what Khalifatul Masih is saying today is extremely wise. And my understanding is the verse 42 of Surah Ankabut, where Allah Ta'ala says, those who take others for helpers instead of Allah, their similitude, their likeness is that of a spider who makes a house for himself, and surely the frailest of all the houses is the house of a spider. We as Ahmadi Muslims are not spiders. We are lions. We are trying to raise a generation of lions. Jonathan, when I was 9th grade student in Pakistan, this infamous Ordinance 20 was promulgated back then, and I used to laugh at it. I would wear my badge of Kalima Tayyiba, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, take a bus, go to the school, and be in the face and say, do whatever you want to do with me, but I will wear my identity on my shirt. I worry about the 9th grader Ahmadi Muslim living in Lahore today. I do not think he can do that. He will be shot. He will be dead. But my message to him is that you are a lion. Yes, they're making it difficult for you, but we are not going to go for spider webs. Our refuge is going to come from Allah, and we need to simply stay true to our Imam, excel in education, and be very pious, righteous Ahmadi Muslims. That is exactly the combination we see in Dr. Mehdi Ali. Why it became such a big news? Because he excelled in his education. He was not an ordinary Ahmadi. And then he had the strong connection with Islam Ahmadiyya. That is the only prescription we have moving forward. And inshallah ta'ala, Allah's help will be with us.
Dr. Yunus, thank you very much for joining us today and really enlightening our viewers with your perspective. Thank you so much. Back into the studio now and to Mr. Yusuf. We've heard that in fact the commandment of Islam is to behave not as a spider but as a lion. But in particular, this is a very beautiful phrase or a very beautiful meaning, because we're not talking about a violent lion or a chaotic lion or one who looks to seek revenge, but we're talking about the strength, the spiritual strength which is required in order to burden persecution and oppression, and that this is in fact the kind of qualities which were seen in the companions of Muhammad, the peace be upon him, in the early days of Islam. So I think it's a very, very beautiful point which Dr. Yunus has made. What's your take on this, Mr. Yusuf? How should the world be responding and how should Muslims be responding?
That's a great question, actually. And let me answer both of those. In terms of the international community, Ayaz Sahab and Dr. Fahim have given very eloquent answers, so I won't duplicate what they have said, other than to say that it is in the interests of the international community, their own interests, that they take notice of what's happening in Pakistan and elsewhere. Look, Pakistan was the first country that was established in the modern era as being a representative country for Muslims. It is incredibly important. It plays a key role in the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. It plays a key role as a spokesperson for Saudi Arabia in the international community. So it is very important. It's also a very powerful nation with 200 million, about 186 million Muslims in Pakistan as well. After 1984, when the anti-Ahmadiyya legislation was passed, just 2 years later, the blasphemy law was passed, which was 295C. And it is that piece of legislation that is being used to persecute Christians, being used to persecute Hindus, being used as a justification for killing other minorities. And so the consequence of the international community not having taken notice of what happened in 1984 is that you then had the blasphemy law, and then you then had the legitimization of persecution in Pakistan, so much so that now it is part of the cultural identity of people in Pakistan to use violence in order to settle their differences. So the killing of Christians, just a year ago 86 Christians were killed in a bombing on their church, the killing of Shias, the killing of Sufis, the killing of Hindus and Ahmadi Muslims is all as a result of what happened in 1984, and that is now being exported. You see there are lots of issues now in Syria, there are issues in Iraq. You cannot detach that sectarianism from what happened in 1984. So if the international community wants stability in the world, it is important that they take notice of the injustices that happen elsewhere in the world. And if I just answer your second question, and I'll be quick because I know that your time is running short. Look, extremists have been trying to eradicate the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat from the very beginning, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and in the modern era in Pakistan through constitutional changes, through case law, through martial law legislation. This has not been democratically put in place. They have been trying to get rid of Ahmadiyya Muslims. They have failed. They will continue to fail. The likes of Dr. Qamar Khalil Ahmad, who was 65 and who was arrested, put in prison and shot whilst in a police station and killed just a few months ago. The Qaid of Nawab Shah, Imtiaz Ahmad, who you've mentioned. If the extremists think that the killing of these individuals or the persecution of Ahmadis in education, in terms of depriving them of their voting rights, in terms of restricting their access to employment and everything else is going to succeed, they won't. The more that you persecute the Ahmadi Muslims, the more determined that they become. And the consequence now is that we're in 204 countries with 100 million Ahmadi Muslims worldwide. So I would encourage them and counsel them finally to listen to His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad and the guidance that he gives on how to secure peace and justice. That is the best way forward for them.
Thank you very much. This is a powerful message, Brother Farooq, from both Mr. Iyaz and also Mr. Yusuf in how the world needs to move forwards. Not only the international community, but also the Muslim community and the Muslims themselves. I think if we could connect this back to Islam, which is very important, and those Muslims, and in fact all of those people around the world who are being persecuted today because of their faith or because of their beliefs in any sense, then the early companions of Islam give a very powerful message to this, I think, Farooq Sahib, don't they? Which is in particular Mr. Bilal, one of the most beloved of the companions of the Prophet of Islam, was put by his slave master under hot stones and demanded that he repent Islam. And he would say, repent Islam and I will release you, Bilal. But all that Bilal would say was, La ilaha illallah, which is, there is no God except Allah, and that Allah is one. Qul huwallahu ahad. So I think that all of those people around the world, whether you be Christian, whether you be Sufis, whether you be Ahmadi Muslims, and you're being persecuted, then the tradition of Islam and the tradition of all of the prophets is to remain steadfast, to remain non-violent, and to pray to Almighty God that the unjust oppressors who oppress you will be removed. And this is the message of the Khalifa of Islam, and this is the only message I think that the Presspoint panelists would like to make today, which is that God is one, do not fear, and pray, and this persecution will be removed. Now, Farooq, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to our viewers at home, and please continue the conversation via social media, and we'll see you in a month's time for episode 18, God willing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Unity has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.